their testimony, what was so unique at the time was you never had missionaries' deaths so much publicized in the media. And I think it's a story that people were able to identify with. And I think people can still identify with John and Betty's words, and their testimony ignited this interest in around the world. And I do believe, especially China, people looking at John and Betty's story and saying, wow, they came to help us. They came to give us the gospel.
Greetings and welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Engagement, joined once again, as I am each week, by none other than Scott W. Dunford, pastor of Western Hills Church in San Mateo, California, and joined by none other than you. Yes, you. Thank you for joining us here on the show today, whether you're watching on YouTube, whether you're listening in your computer browser, or most of you are listening in your podcast platform of choice. We greatly appreciate it. And you know, this is the season of giving. It is the holidays. The Lord Jesus Christ has been born. And what better way to celebrate the season than by leaving the Missions Podcast a 5-star rating and review? I mean, really, nothing goes with Christmas better than doing that thing. This show is the gift that keeps on giving. And so share it with a friend. But in all seriousness, we hope you and your families are doing well. And Scott, how's your Christmas season been this year?
It's been amazing, Alex. What can I say about it? There's no words, but it was great.
Well, good. Well, if there's no more words about oh my gosh. Scott, how are you doing, brother? It's so good to see your face.
So good to be seen. We were talking with our guest off screen and just, we were trying to tell him how professional we are. And I think this is great because he gets to see it right up close and personal. This is, I'm sure, just blowing his mind. So,
well, we are professionals. At least we're amateurs that do it every week for 7 or 8 years in a row. So
that's right.
I don't know if that makes us still amateurs or professionals. I don't know at what point you get promoted to professional, but we've been doing it a lot. I can tell you we've got a lot of reps in.
That's right. Well, I am very eager to talk to our next guest. And without further ado, I'm just going to jump into it. We're really excited to welcome Andrew Montonera. He's an author, and he's also related to someone who has had an impact on my life. He's author of a new book that just came out by Moody called By Life or Death. The story of John and Betty Stam. And so without further ado, welcome Andrew to our show. We're so glad to have you here. Thanks for joining us and putting up with all of our nonsense.
Thank you guys for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you for putting up with Scott's nonsense. So tell me, Andrew, it's good to have you on the show. Tell me, what is it that led you to write this book here?
For people who don't know, I have a family connection to John and Betty Stam. One of my great-grandfathers, Cornelius Stam, was John Stam's younger brother. And so growing up, I knew Cornelius Stam as Grandpa Stam. He passed away when I was 5 years old. But I'd grown up kind of hearing the story of John and Betty Stam. They were missionary martyrs to China. They were graduates of Moody Bible Institute. I kind of knew the basics as I was growing up. Being related and family of Cornelius, my family inherited a lot of John and Betty's items, their materials, some letters, John Stam's Bibles. When I was growing up, and I do talk about this in the preface of the book, but growing up, my grandmother showed me this frail glass case of books in her office at her house. And I was just a young boy, and I was kind of curious. I said, "What are these?" And she said, "Those belonged to Grandpa Stam's brother who was killed in China." And so as a young boy, I was kind of very intrigued by these old books and these relics. What were these, and why did John Stam die? And so 3 years ago, I stumbled across those same books, and it kind of got me intrigued again. What was this story, and who were these people? Why did they give their lives to China and to the gospel? And so it really made me want to dive deep into the story again of who these people were, what was their testimony. And I still believe they can impact new generations. So I kind of wanted to tell kind of an updated story
So when I was young, I hope others will take my testimony and apply it to their own raising their own kids. But I was surrounded by biographies of Christians, and there was a series that we had with biographies of like Hudson Taylor, William Carey, um, uh, Gladys Allward, and one of the books in that series was about John and Betty Stam. And I remember reading that book, and it deeply impacted me because here is an era of history that I was very interested in, World War II era. And here were two Christians that went to a school I knew about, Moody Bible Institute, and the story of them eventually giving their lives for the gospel of Jesus Christ, and how inspiring that was to me, even at a young age. Of course, later on, then visiting Moody and seeing the little plaque that's on the wall, it kind of hits you in a different way. And then my family, Andrew had served overseas in China as missionaries, and when we were raising support, I talked a little bit about their story in our presentations because it was that kind of that inspiring to me. But probably there's a whole generation of people that don't know the story of John and Betty Stam, or maybe they only heard the name. So tell us a little bit about them and what makes their story so inspirational.
John and Betty Stam were, like you said, they were a young missionary couple who graduated from Moody Bible Institute. They both met at Moody Bible Institute in 1929. Betty was a year older than John.
She was a missionary kid already, right?
She was a missionary kid already. So Betty grew up in China. She was born in Michigan, but actually was raised in China. I believe her parents took her there when she was 6 months old. So and then she had 4 other siblings that were all born in China. So she grew up a missionary kid. She was accustomed to the Chinese people, the language a little bit before coming back to school. She did her undergrad at Wilson College in Pennsylvania, and then actually went to Moody Bible Institute after that. And then John grew up in Paterson, New Jersey on the East Coast, was born into a very faith-filled home, had many siblings. John's father, Peter Stam, started a missions organization called Star of Hope Mission, which was kind of an outreach to the Paterson, New Jersey community. They did a lot of gospel messages and sermons and Sunday school classes, and just really wanted to serve that community as a whole. And that ministry is actually still going on today, over 100 years later, as Star of Hope Ministries now, which is incredible to think about. Mm-hmm. But John and Betty both served with China Inland Mission, which was founded by Hudson Taylor. Mm-hmm. And Betty went to China in 1931, and then John followed a year later in 1932. They were both married in 1933, and what people most know them for really is just their martyrdom and the rescue of their daughter, Helen, which in itself is a whole incredible story. But they were both, in December of 1934, John and Betty were captured, and 2 days later, they were both beheaded by communist soldiers. And friends of the Stams and other Chinese mission workers helped rescue their 3-month-old daughter, Helen, who survived all of it. And so there's a lot of twists and turns in the story, which it's a little complicated to explain.
What were some of the details? Like, I know you were kind of glossing over the details, but that's what we want.
Yeah.
So what were some of the details that, as you researched this, shocked you, surprised you, that you found like that was just so compelling? Like, I know I don't know the details, so I really want you to hear, but like a couple of things that just like really impacted me was just, one, the Chinese, the housekeepers that tried to keep them from being taken away, and that were threatened with death, and the danger of their daughter, and the way that they ended up hiding her, and then she was miraculously found by a Chinese pastor. At least that's the way I read the story. Or even the Chinese national that tried to interfere while they're being marched to their execution, and ended up joining them in martyrdom. Those are stories that they blew my mind. What are some of the other? You can embellish on those or add to those, but also what are some of the other stories that just really inspired you as you were going through this?
Hey, listeners, if you've been here for a while, you know our tagline already: helping goers think and thinkers go. Well, we really mean that. Let me ask you, what are you going to do with everything that you're listening to right now on this show? And could it be that the Lord is leading you to join his mission and extend his kingdom among the nations in a new way? Remember that God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. He gets the most glory by using normal, weak, doubting people. Maybe you're ready to say what the prophet Isaiah said, "Here I am, Lord, send me." If you think missions, whether that's short-term or long-term, is in your future, we are here to partner with you and your church in the process of sending you. Our team wants to talk to you here at ABWE. We're a family of ministries extending across more than 80 nations of the globe, engaged in evangelism, discipleship, and church planting. Our team wants to talk to you. Go to abwe.org/sendme. Again, abwe.org/sendme, all one word. No guilt trips, no high-pressure sales tactics, just a friendly voice here to pray with you as you and your church discern your calling. So start the conversation now. abwe.org/sendme.
Well, yeah, like you said, Scott, there were multiple people who gave their lives so that their daughter Helen could live. And it's kind of these, I tell the book in a way where it's actually like the first book about the Stams that was written in 1935, The Triumph of John and Betty Stam. I tell it in my book in a similar way where it's the Stams, John and Betty's portion, their death, and then I kind of go back and tell Pastor Lowe, who was the man who ultimately rescued Helen, kind of his side of the story.
Yeah, tell us about that.
John and Betty were captured, and they were moved to a different city the next day. They were taken to a different town. And Pastor Lowe and a Pastor Shang, there's two Pastor Shangs in the story, so it does get a little confusing there. There's one Shang who pleaded for John and Betty's life as they were being marched to their execution, and he eventually was killed after a soldier followed him home and found a Bible and hymnal in his house. But that Shang was also friends with Pastor Lowe, who was supposed to meet John and Betty in the town they were ultimately killed in. And so this Shang, this man, intervened. Pastor Lowe was taken captive, and Shang actually vouched for Lowe. And then I believe it was the next day, Shang tried to intervene for John and Betty's life. But without that intervention of Lowe never would have maybe rescued their daughter. So it's just kind of these ins and outs of events that happened that it's almost hard to fathom. Had certain things not taken place, we don't know what ultimately, it probably would have been a very much darker outcome.
Darker in what way? I mean, I think a lot of people would look at it and say, this is a pretty dark situation here. How it ended, it obviously ended with the death of two missionaries. But what would you say that the whole community, the missionaries, the churches, what were they spared from then that could have been even far worse?
I mean, Pastor Lowe could have been killed, and other people in that group that ultimately rescued their daughter. So that might not have taken place had this Chinese Christian intervene for him. But it's just incredible that John was actually supposed to meet him in this town anyways, that he happened to also go to in that same time frame for all that to happen. And there's other things that while researching and writing, I found out that I just think are incredible. One of the connections is Betty Scott's family actually knew Elizabeth Elliot's family, the Howards. So that's an interesting, incredible connection in missions history that people don't really know or talk about much. So the Scott family was very close friends with the Howards, who had come back as missionaries from Belgium back to Pennsylvania. And so a 4-year-old Elizabeth Elliot actually met Betty Scott shortly before she left for China.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. That's such an interesting small world that we live in. And for those of you who don't know, it should know who Elizabeth Elliot is, but her book Through Gates of Splendor tells the story of her and her husband and his martyrdom, and but also uh, the rest of the story of her and Nate Saint's sister going back into the jungle with Elizabeth's little daughter and reaching those same people for Christ is an incredible story. So what's the impact on the Chinese church? You know, we it's natural for us to hear, oh, Michigan, Chicago, we understand these places. I lived in Michigan for a long time. We see people that kind of look like us. And if you look at the picture of John and Betty, I mean, they're attractive, an attractive couple. Uh, we can imagine being in their shoes. And yet you're telling the story and helping us to see that there was not just two martyrs in this story. There's actually a whole host of Chinese believers that were involved and courageous and faithful. And we go through that dark period of history, and yet out of it we find a Chinese church that's really began to flourish and grow. So what is the impact of the Stams and Pastor Lowe and Pastor Shang and the impact on the Chinese church? Were you able to find that out in any of your research?
As far as my research, I believe that their story gave hope and word of the Stams to a lot of China, and especially the Anhui province. People were so receptive to the story, and I think it's one of those stories. I mean, look even beyond the missions part. These people gave so much of themselves for these people. Their testimony was so unique at the time. Was you never had missionaries' deaths so much publicized in the media in December 1934. Something like a story like this just grabbed people's attention. And I think it's a story that people were able to identify with. And I think people can still identify with John and Betty's words and their testimony. But it's one of those things, you put yourself in their place, even if a family member, if you say your brother or sister, losing someone like that, and then at the same time their daughter, not knowing what's going to happen to her. It just ignited this interest in around the world, and I do believe especially China, of people looking at John and Betty's story and saying, wow, they came to help us. They came to give us the gospel. And I know people ultimately did. A lot of Chinese gave their lives to Christ as a result of their martyrdom.
Well, what about you personally? I mean, obviously the family connection is significant here. I can't imagine that you're working through this material, or you're reading these stories, you're realizing, okay, generations of Chinese believers have been formed in their faith because of the witness of these family members of mine. And what kind of effect does that have on your faith as you're writing this? Does that make you feel inadequate? Does that make you feel that you want to rise to that occasion? What does that do in your soul as you're thinking about those things? You're pouring them out before God and you're reflecting upon that legacy that's in your very own blood.
I think ultimately it just wanted me to be faithful to whatever God's calling me to. I'm in my mid-20s. This was my first book. While I'm reading and researching, I felt kind of just igniting that same spirit that gave passion to John and Betty, being able to read their own words. And that just had such an impact in terms of what am I doing with my own faith, with my own life and my daily walk with Christ. And so ultimately I just want to be faithful as much as possible. And maybe that calling was to write the book. I don't know if that was a huge calling in my life, but God put that upon my heart. And maybe it was, I just look at it as the big picture of, okay, God, you put Cornelius Stam in my own family's life. You used him. You used then that family connection to draw me to where I am today. And nearly like 90 years later, just because of a few little books that were recovered from John and Betty's home, stuff that wasn't taken by the communist soldiers who kidnapped them, that would give inspiration to me.
Tell me about the books. What was he reading?
It was probably a lot of some theological stuff. There's several Bibles.
Because I'm so fascinated by this stuff, Alex. When you read William Carey's Inquiry, and you realize, and you start seeing the theological things that he was reading.
Yeah.
And you see that in other works like Andrew Fuller or other missionaries, like,
Oh yeah, these guys
these
were well
great
read.
these great heroes of the faith, like, weren't developed in a vacuum, and they were impacted and influenced. So that to me, that's so is so fascinating. Were you able to read any of his letters? Did any of his letters survive, and what did you find in those?
Yeah, a lot of his letters, the majority of Stam material is actually at Wheaton College. And so being in the Chicago area already, it was very convenient for me to take trips down to Wheaton to go through dozens of John and a few of Betty's, but mainly John's letters. They also have one of John's diaries that was recovered. And so that to me, that was just a treasure and trying to use pieces of those to help tell their story. I can say I do remember one of the books I think was by Arno Gabeline. So I
Hmm.
think that was one of the books that John had in his collection. And I know that the Stam family was actually friends with Gabeline and Ironside and Donald Barnhouse. So some of those, influential figures from that
Yeah.
time in theology and just
Hmm.
teaching had a big impact on the Stams. One of the things I found interesting was Donald Barnhouse actually visited John and Betty a few months before their death. And I,
Huh.
I never knew that. I only found that out through one of the letters where John talks about that visit. So
Wow.
that to me is just another incredible connection.
That is fascinating. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever read the the uh the journal of why of Jim Elliot. Sorry, my brain just had a brain fog for a second. Of Jim Elliot. But if you read those journal articles and even his interactions, like how he's wrestling with getting married to Elizabeth Elliot, and is wrestling with being called to the mission field, and what that kind of sacrifice that would mean, and you read that and you realize, whatever happened to him on the beach, on the Oca beach, in Ecuador, that had been begun in his life so much earlier. And it's no surprise, that he would give his life to the Lord, because that was already being cultivated in him for many years before that. What did you find out about, his personality, his interests, as you're looking through his letters? Did anything come out that really was interesting to you?
The relationship dynamic between John and Betty, I think, was one of the most fascinating things for me. Because you had two young people, they met at Moody, and they actually met through the China prayer group that would meet on Monday evenings. Just that whole dynamic of falling in love, not really knowing, because Betty, again, was a year older than John, where were their callings. Betty had
Mm,
felt called to the mission field, but John wasn't sure if at the time if he was going to be even accepted by the China Inland Mission.
hmm,
John's father also hopeful that John would come back to Paterson, New Jersey, to work with the Star of Hope mission because Peter was getting older. So it's kind of they would kind of wrestle with. John would write home and say, not sure where God's, or in the letters and diary, where God's calling me to, or, am I making the right decision about should I pursue Betty or not?
Mm.
And they ultimately did wait. They put that relationship on hold until they both fully felt that God was calling them to the mission field and to the same country.
mm.
So that was really, I think, for me, just something that stuck out. And I think people, this generation, especially younger people, especially my generation, that maybe that's something they can identify with and hopefully look at in a positive light in terms of approaching a relationship.
Yeah, a lot of wisdom there to be willing to defer the personal enjoyment of a relationship while you're trying to figure out your calling, and just recognizing if I'm going to answer a missionary call, that might mean that the Lord will bring a spouse my direction that is like minded, or it might mean I'm going to have to say no to certain things, and just being willing to pay that price, or at least wait until the Lord brings some of those things into alignment. I think there's a lot of wisdom there to that kind of delayed gratification. I'm also just struck with the fact that as you look at the past of some of these missionary figures, not just the Stams, but others, you could look at some examples that they're ordinary. They're some of the most radically ordinary individuals, and I think we get this picture in our minds of missionary saints and heroes from history, and we think that they walked, they levitated, that they glowed, they radiated this holiness that we
Mm-hmm.
couldn't possibly attain to. And I think, Scott, one of the things that we see when we read these stories is, no, wait a second, they're just like me, sinful, flawed, broken, etc. Which also means there goes my excuse, because it doesn't take a special type of person; it just takes a special type of God doing the calling and that person listening and being willing and obedient, right?
Yeah, for sure. And just being able to kind of put flesh and blood on those things, and it takes a story, kind of unfortunately, it seems like it takes a sensational story with with a tragic ending to kind of put a highlight on that. But you know, the beautiful thing is, and I'm sure Andrew, you'd probably agree with this, is that there's been thousands of people like John and Betty Stam serving the Lord all over the world, and by God's grace, they were able to minister and live to an old age and raise children and die and or retire, at one point. And yet, in God's providence and we'd say goodness in this side of understanding, um, that isn't the ending of the story for John and Betty Stam. But because of that, their whole story, their whole life is kind of being able to put forward to us as an example. And so really thank you for taking the time to write this book. And what are some of the other takeaways that you think that this generation needs to learn from the life of John and Betty?
I think whatever your calling is, be present in the moment.
Mm.
Be present to whatever's going on around you. You don't necessarily have to be a missionary overseas. You can be a missionary right here in your backyard, in your church, in your community. And that's something that John and Betty did with their whole life. Even before they felt a calling to go to China, is they tried to be as faithful as they could to Christ and God's commands. So I think people can get a lot out of the book. It's not only a biography in a sense; it's also kind of I hope, kind of a preservation of their words, their material. There's some writings of theirs in the book that have never been published before or published in full length. So you actually get to read John Stam's testimony that he gave shortly before leaving for China, his Moody graduation speech, which has never been published in full length before, a letter that Betty wrote to her sister Beatrice that not many people have seen. And then some of Betty's own poetry, and there's the Time magazine article that was written after their martyrdom is in the book. So it's kind of, I hope that people can take away just looking at the influence that they had on so many people. And there's new testimonies as well in the book by people who were impacted. I mentioned Elizabeth Elliot, but the Graham family, for example. Ruth Bell Graham grew up a missionary kid in China. She was greatly impacted. Pastor Chuck Smith of Calvary Chapel, he thought the Stam story was one of his favorites. And so he shared the story with his daughter Cheryl. And so there's a quote from Cheryl in the book about that. So I was trying to also take, what can I preserve for future generations? Even if you don't know the name John and Betty, you probably know someone who was impacted by them.
So how can people find out more? How can they get a hold of your book? If they want to do more research, where would you direct them to?
You can get the book from Moody Publishers. It's also available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Christian book distributors. You can go to andrewmontonera.com and find a link if you'd like a signed copy, even though my autograph's worth nothing.
Still cool.
And people have asked for it, so I'm happy to offer that. If they want more info, I think you can read online. Again, Wheaton College published a few years back an article that features some of the writings and photos. And it was, I think, like Wheaton Archive's most popular article, actually. I think they had told me, but a few years back they wrote an article. So their story and name still resonates with so many in the Christian church and in missions worldwide. So I'm just grateful for that. I'm also on Facebook as just Andrew Montonera. You can follow me or feel free to message me if you have any questions or want to know more about the book.
Well, Andrew, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your work with this book. We'd encourage everyone to pick it up where good books are sold. And thank you for joining us today on the Missions Podcast. Before you know, we want to remind you that, as always, we're going to pick up the conversation in our bonus segment, our overtime show exclusively for Missions Podcast subscribers. And this really brings up the whole topic of martyrs in the Christian church in general, and how can we learn from their stories? Also, how do we think through the critiques? Sometimes accusations are made that this person or that person, maybe they were naive, maybe they shouldn't have been in this wrong situation at the wrong time on the mission field. And how do we deal with those concerns when they're raised in the context of church history and even our own recent history of modern missions? We'll get into that in our overtime segment for subscribers. You're welcome to listen in. Go to missionspodcast.com/premium to join. And when you become a partner of the Missions Podcast for $9.99 a month, you're not only making this content possible, you're also getting access to all of our bonus shows, each week recorded after the main conversation, as well as quarterly live streams, our group chat, and a gift to all of our new members. And so what are you waiting for? Go to missionspodcast.com/premium to get access now. And remember, the Missions Podcast is a ministry of ABWE. Go to abwe.org to learn more about how you can take your next steps in the Great Commission. And so from all of us here at the Missions Podcast, until our next episode, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and go make disciples of all nations.